Hi, everyone. For those of you who do not know, my name is Nat, Head of Community, Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodiverse people in understanding how their brain works. And we are going to be looking at IQ today, intelligence as a whole. Why is that even relevant to what we do as an organization? Well, unfortunately, neurodiverse people get a bit of a bad rep for having intellectual challenges. Now, yes and no, but as a whole, being neurodiverse isn't related to intelligence. And we're going to be kind of picking that apart a little bit. I don't know about any of you, but as someone who is neurodiverse, I've always felt dumb and stupid at school. People always looked down upon me. I was always in the lowest sets. People had a very, very low expectation of where I'd go in life. And the way they marked me and kind of made that judgment wasn't accurate, and if anything, it probably had a lot of negative effects on me. And I think I've been trying to compensate my entire life, trying to overcome that stigma of being less intelligent than my peers. Something which a lot of people don't tell you is that any of you who might have ADHD or autism, typically you tend to be a few years behind your peers. So on average, I'm about 2 years behind my peers when I was developing. So my intelligence was impacted a bit. I couldn't tie my shoelaces. I couldn't read at the same time. I couldn't write. I can do it now, but it took me longer to get to that point. And it's another thing that can be quite problematic. So today we are going to be looking at all different types of thinking with a particular lens on like neurodivergent conditions. And as I mentioned, we are exceptional individuals. Here's a picture of our lovely team. 2015, we were started. 80% of our team are neurodiverse. Don't want to brag, but we're a bunch of smart cookies, if I do say so myself. However, if you were to ask most of us, academically, we're failures. So we're going to really be playing with what is intelligence today. Yeah, I'm currently also doing a master's in neuroscience. So it's hard to compare really what it means to be smart and what it means to be dumb, and if those labels are even accurate at all. Now, if any of you do like to learn, which hopefully you do, we do these webinars every single Thursday. And the last one we did was on the science of ADHD. So this is where we look about what does it actually mean to have ADHD? How is the brain talking to each other? Medication, what does it do? What's all this thing about dopamine and an excess of it? So do check out on our YouTube channel. Okay, so what are some of the things we are going to be looking at today? We're going to be looking at what is an IQ test. We hear a lot about them, but not many people really know what they are. How impactful are they on culture and society? We're also going to be looking at a bit of history and eugenics. The Nazis were a big fan of IQ tests. Didn't work out well for them. Also in the US, a lot of people were put to death, to be honest, if they had low IQs. So there is this big historical context. And we also look at how people get jobs and interviews, how we see ourselves, the sets we're put in at school. However, I don't want to act like this is all doom and gloom. There are actually benefits of IQ tests. So what might those IQ tests be? We're also going to look at the bell curve. And in short, this is just a way of looking at the average intelligence of the society and culture we live in. But it'll be interesting because if you're looking at this bell curve historically, some parts of the population were more likely to have lower intelligence than the other. Suddenly you're starting to look at like superior races. But when you go into it a little bit more, you realize the people who created the tests was of a certain background. So a lot of bias was put into it. An example of this, if you're judging immigrants on their intelligence and they can barely speak English and the test is in English, naturally they're going to score quite low on an IQ test. So society thinks they are of a lower ability. However, we haven't tested them in a fair way. And the same kind of logic can be put on neurodiverse individuals. If we're judging them the same way we judge neurotypical people, those who do not have a variation in terms of how their brain processes information, we're going to get results which aren't particularly favorable, and also how IQ is measured. Now, you're going to notice I'm going to probably go a little bit overboard today on Simpsons gifts. And the reason why I focus on the Simpsons today is they're a really great example of how intelligence is non-binary. For instance, Homer, is he smart? Is he dumb? A lot of people has known him as a bit of a dumb bum. He's always kind of falling over, making mistakes. However, he's been to space. He's had every job in the sun. He has done incredible things. And that is ridiculously great. You've got Lisa, who is arguably the most intelligent person ever. However, she's lonely, she's depressed, she doesn't always have the same confidence. You've got Bart, who's an underachiever, but also is relatively popular, really outgoing, very good with his hands. So intelligence is really interesting. You could even argue that Maggie, the baby, is one of the smartest characters, yet she can't even talk yet. So you could say that she has the most potential in the future. But if you compare her intelligence currently to, say, Bart is going to be more intelligent. It's a complicated matter, but it's why I'm using them as a case study today. So first of all, what is IQ? Well, IQ is just a measure of intelligence. And it's a bit more than that. But another thing we are going to be looking at are people who have a higher IQ more likely to be depressed, as this lovely graph shows. Interestingly, yeah, it has been shown that you're at higher risk of depression the higher your IQ is. Oh, let's see what we've got here. Learning styles influence how we take in information. Is there a style more common with autism, ADHD, etc.? I mean, that's a good question. The real answer, no. Short answer is maybe more kind of visual and creative. That tends to be for those who have dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia. But before I go into too much detail, we're not talking about arts and crafts here. We're just talking about people who are able to put things together in a different way, who are allowed more autonomy on how they make things work. But thanks for that question. And if any of you, anyone else has questions, feel free to click that little button there and say a message, or in the chat on Zoom. And I'm more than happy to kind of keep this flexible. So here, a quick question to all of you. Define intelligence. What do you think intelligence is? Now, this either could be a definition that you've heard of before, your own thoughts and opinions, or anything in between. I mean, it's a difficult question, to be fair, if you really think about it.
I kind of know what it is, but I can't put it into words.
Yeah, it's one of those things you think you know it when you see it or around it, but who knows? I mean, is intelligence just about like processing? Is it about the speed you process? Is it around emotional intelligence? Is it the whole package? Is it like what academic set you are in? Is it your potential in life? So, if we're going to America, President Trump, when he, not the nicest guy, but he became president. Did that make him smart? Did the money that he had in order to get a head start in life give him the upper hand? Did the lawyers get really smart? Or is it the popularity which allowed him to get that position? It's so non-black and white. Okay, we've got the ability to apply knowledge and skills. Absolutely. I think that's a good way of looking at it. So that isn't the ability to learn knowledge and skills, but just the ability to apply it. Because we all know people who were at school who achieved absolutely amazing, straight A's all the way. However, they did nothing with their lives. And that also shows you that just because you might have an academic background doesn't mean that you have a very practical way of putting it together. Like our CEO, Danny, who's in the chat today, he never went to university, just went and played football. And not particularly very academic, but he was very good with life skills and went off to rule exceptional individuals with an iron fist.
Oh, thanks for the feedback, Nat.
No, but it just shows you that if you look at many CEOs or many millionaires or billionaires, a lot of them didn't actually go to school or dropped out. And it shows you how just because you might have an academic background doesn't always translate to real world success. I actually know a lot of people who have like doctorates who have no common sense whatsoever. So it's really kind of hard to touch, not very tangible. We've got a combination of multiple aspects of how one thinks, reacts, understand, and use material, and the ability to process information in a way to solve real problems. Yeah, I think that's another really good one as well. Keep bringing it back. Ultimately, there's not really a complete answer, and that kind of leaves a lot of gray area. Now, the definition from Mensa, which is like the company to go to when you're thinking of intelligent people, they say it's a type of standard score which indicates how far above or how far below his or her peer group an individual stands in mental ability. So this is when they're talking about IQ in particular. And they kind of really simplify it to its pure basics. A standard score. So what they mean by that is it's standardized. So it's ideally the same score for every single person. Now that already is problematic, and we're going to be talking about that soon because there isn't just one score. There's lots of different scores. And it also rates how far or above you are to your peers. Now, how you rate yourself to your peers, there's a few ways of looking at it. So if you're a child, you would typically take your age, and you would also look at the score, and you'd look at about your future prospects of how likely you are to do in life, judging on your current mental capacity. But as you become an adult, you can't really measure people by the same logic, because what is the difference between a 32-year-old and a 35-year-old? Not much. So you need a different way of looking at it. So typically we judge children and adults very differently. Now, to give you an idea, considered to be smart to get into Mensa, which actually Lisa Simpson did get into, you have to be in the top 2% of the scoring system. To give you like a rough idea, most of us is around 100. We mostly have an IQ of 100. That's the average. I think Einstein had one of like 160, which is, pretty smart. The smartest person ever, I think it was something like 270. And if you have lower than 100, you have a low IQ. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're not intelligent. And hopefully I'll be able to prove that by the end of this session. So quick question to all of you. In your humble opinions, do you think intelligent tests are helpful or unhelpful as a whole? Okay, interesting. Unhelpful. Yeah, a bit more balance. Oh, this is going all over the place. Okay, 50-50. Now that is interesting, but also I'd say quite accurate. It's quite easy for those who have been failed by the system to say it's unhelpful. Well, for obvious reasons, but there's many reasons why they can be a useful benchmark. If we look at why they were even invented in the first place, nearly 100 years ago, I believe. And it was mainly in France because in schools, children weren't getting the support they needed. So they created the idea of the IQ test in order to make sure children could get the right sets, the right support. It can also give you a benchmark on where to set the right level. We all know that intelligence isn't black or white, but if we don't try to uniform it in at least a simple way, how do we know how best to support people? So now I mentioned that there are different types of tests, and this is something which I think a lot of people aren't familiar with. If you say know your IQ and you're like, yeah, I've got 120, and someone else tells you, oh, well, mine's only 100, you start to compare yourself against the person, and it creates people who have and those who do not have. And that has happened all the time when it comes to neurodiversity. The reason we had autism and Asperger's is to separate them because people didn't like to be kind of stigmatized with a lower intellectual ability. And then people start saying, Asperger's is better. So they decided to get rid of Asperger's and just make it ASD, autism spectrum disorder. So it's always a bit of a power struggle. But the thing which a lot of people, again, don't take into consideration is there's multiple ways to skin a cat, as they say. There's different tests. So here is a little selection of just some of the tests that are currently available or used in society. And let me know which ones you've heard of, or maybe you've heard of none of them. But I think what makes it particularly interesting is that, let's say you did one of the tests and someone else did another test. I bet you when you're talking about your scores to people, you're not really mentioning which one you did and which one they did. Some of these are quite rudimental, really basic. They just look at where other people in your peer group is. Others are just aimed at children. Others are aimed at adult. Most of them are related to your cognitive ability. Some are more focused on processing. I can see a lot of you have picked that one, and some of you hadn't heard of any of them. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you haven't heard of any of them at all. One of the first ones was this one, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. And one that we use mostly today is these ones at the bottom. But again, it's not really that consistent. So again, question to all of you, in your opinion, what do you think is the best measure of intelligence? If you were going to maybe hire someone, have someone on your team, what would you consider is a good base mark of intelligence? And I did warn you about all the Simpsons gifts today. Now, the reason why I put this particular GIF is that, is Homer smart because he was able to create a child who is a genius, Lisa? Is Lisa smart if her father doesn't seem to have the highest intelligence? What about Bart? Because all these people are so individual, but yet they're all connected. So is intelligence based on genes? Well, they have the same genes, so maybe not. Is intelligence based on education? Well, Bart and Lisa go to the same school. Is intelligence, based on personal capacity or want to learn? A lot of open questions. One we got here is problem solving. So yeah, maybe it's the ability to solve problems. But are we talking about problems around empathy or kind of social connections? Some people say there's like academic intelligence, there's analytical intelligence, there's creative intelligence, there's also practical intelligence. The way it has been split down is kind of infinite, depending on who you ask. And maybe it's more related to the reason why. So for instance, if you're really intelligent, but you have no skills in mechanics, you probably wouldn't be very good working in a garage. So you've got to kind of make sure it relates. Now we're going to look at some uses. Why might knowing someone's intelligence be used today, for better or for worse? So on here, I just want you to let me know, have you ever had an IQ test in general, just a general intelligence test in either of the following? Due to the education system, either when you have been diagnosed for some condition, maybe for part of a research project, or in a job application. Now, I would imagine most of you have had them for quite a lot of them. We've all had them in education. We've all been in different sets in school, top set, bottom set, set 1, set F, whatever. And it allows schools to set the work at a level which is most appropriate for X or Y student. But the thing is, there's always when we kind of make these kind of hard and fast cutoff periods, there's always going to be some students which get hard done by. So for instance, who is the smartest person in the bottom set? It also creates a hard dynamic. I remember when I was at school, it was really challenging for me because I was really good at art and really good at science. Yeah, I was always the best at science. However, I was in the bottom set in science. Why? Well, because I couldn't write or spell. And I couldn't do maths. So that kind of brought everything else down. So when we're looking at these tests, they are reviewing like a baseline of everything, but they're not taking into account individual elements. And this is something which neurodiverse people typically get the raw deal. They get judged as a generalist when really we are more specialists in nature. And that again has a big impact. If you're looking at job interviews, people are judging you on being a good all-rounder. They're not looking at you for a specialist position. And other ones we mentioned were also tests and data, but tests are done in every part of our life. Whether it could be a drugs test, it could be a quiz, there's so many different tests for everything. So again, in your opinion, when it comes to school sets, do you think they support learning? Are you in favor of putting children in different sets based on their perceived cognitive ability? Or do you think, no, it doesn't work? Okay, interesting, 100%. Now, I was always quite torn on this one myself, because in some ways it does make the most kind of sense on the surface, but on another way, no, because I was put in a class which was the bottom set because I take longer to process. I'm very smart, if I do say so myself, but it takes me longer. Oh, Danny, stop it. But it does take me a lot longer to process. Like I'll have to really think about something. So if you give me an hour test, I'm going to completely flunk it. But if you give me a lot more time, I'll probably do quite well on it. But also, you've got some people who are really ambitious, who aren't very good, who fail a lot, but will never give up. And then you've got other people who just don't really care. You know, they're not that bothered. So maybe you might want to put people in sets based on their ambition or their motivation or their interests. You know, you tell me, what do you think would be a better way of grouping people when it comes to sets? Maybe sets aren't even that good and you'd want to mix it up a little bit on purpose. Because why would you write, you know, there was no like reason to push myself. I remember in UK schools, at least, if you're in the bottom sets, if you were to do exams, you would do like the lower tier, and the highest grade you can get was a C. You couldn't get higher than a C. They kind of capped it. So why would you even try to learn more complex things? It wasn't in your advantage to push yourself. Now we're going to have a look at the impact on intelligence. You know, what people think of our intelligence, how does that impact us throughout our life? So on this scale, I want you to rate yourself. Maybe you know your IQ, so you might want to put you might want to put it on there, or maybe you just want to have a guess. So you might want to say, you know, on the left, really low IQ, or on the right, really superior IQ. Oh, nice. We've got some people who are good, high opinion. And this is not surprising. If you were to ask most people to rate their intelligence, typically as a society, we always rate ourselves higher than we actually are. On average, we're about 100. You know, unless I got lucky and this group is just super geniuses, we're overestimating ourselves. And this is, again, really interesting because we're comparing as well. But also, if we look at the group, it's quite diverse, which is good. But if you look at the general statistics around, if you're from a minority background, as I mentioned previously, you're more likely to have a lower IQ. Now, this starts to get a bit dodgy, like, oh, you know, Hitler was like the superior race. But the way they were judging people wasn't fair. And the same thing happens with those who are neurodiverse. If you had an intellectual disability, you could have been euthanized or put in a lower set or kind of not given the same opportunities in life. So you'll notice the gap gets further and further and further. That 100 score is completely made up, and yet it has been used to determine people's lives for so often. I'm sure some of you have applied for jobs where they've done psychometric testing and they've kind of just given you a score. That one score determines whether or not you get a job and a great career, or if you're unemployed and on benefits and end up with depression. It seems ridiculous, but those are the metrics that we use. Now, I did promise we'd talk a bit about a bell curve, and here we are. So this curve just shows you it's a bit of a bell shape, and this gives you an idea of where the most of society lies. So as I said, 100 here is a good base score, and most people are 100. Now, it varies. I'd say most of you, if I was to take a guess, is have an 85 IQ to 115. That is what is considered average. And then it kind of like tapers off the more you go. Now, if you watch, I don't know if any of you watch The Chase, like great daytime TV, a lot of them have very high IQs. But I think The Beast has the highest IQ, but Anne Haggerty, I don't know, I forget all their names now, but she actually has a lower IQ, but she has a higher overall win count. So maybe she's the smartest. But this is kind of what we notice, really. And this Goldilocks era is the people who get the most opportunities in life. It has been shown that the more you are along the smarter side, the higher you are with depression, mental illness, you might have more difficulties with social interactions, and the same kind of goes the other way as well. So do not think just because you're in this green zone that necessarily you're better off in life. Oh, no, sorry, I mean, just because you're in this smarter blue area, you're in a better off in life. It tends not to work that way. You know, we all know people like Vincent van Gogh was incredibly intelligent and yet clinically depressed. Hopefully not trying to bum you out, you know. So knowing a person's IQ, do you think it's helpful? Like, we know Einstein's IQ. If we know someone has a low IQ, do you think this gives us a better foundation in order to help them? Yes or no? Agree or disagree? Okay, we got, again, mixing it up a little bit. Now, the argument for both is this. By knowing someone's IQ, you can help them. So for instance, you know, there's no point giving a baby a massive dictionary to read. It's just not within their ability at this moment in time. So you actually might make life a lot harder then. If I gave you a big book, which just you weren't able to read, it might put you off learning for life. But on the other side, if you disagree that IQs aren't helpful, well, they're not really, because if you have a lower IQ, you might have a lower opinion of yourself, or people might not want to give you opportunities, or they might not give you the best start in life. You might not be able to use the things you are really good at because people, again, do not give you the chance. So with most things, it's not black or white, and they need to be taken into consideration. So we're doing great, and we're moving on sharply now to interpreting the scores. When you've been told that you have X score, maybe you scored this on a dyslexia test, autism test, intellectual test, you know, whatever, what are you actually meant to do with that data? So again, on this one, I want you to just rate your own skills. You know, on maybe you do like a 10 out of 10 if you think you're amazing at maths, or language, you might want to do a 0 if you're really terrible at kind of getting your words across. I know for me, I'm always stumbling across my words, so I'd probably give myself quite a low language score, even though I'm okay at talking. Then you've got relationships, which is emotional intelligence. Memory. Some people are really high IQ, but if you ask them to remember things, they can't remember anything at all. There's other people who are called savants in the world who can tell you dates in the calendar. Like if you said, what day was it on the 31st of January, 1896? They could tell you the exact day it was because they can work out the maths. But if you ask them to interpret some emotions from facial expressions, they might not have the foggiest idea. All right, so interestingly, a lot of you have said bad at memory, but a lot of you are really good at problem solving. And this is really interesting because your IQ would be taking all of these into consideration. So you might get, say, I don't know, 100 IQ points, but your problem solving skills are really, really high. And if your job involves problem solving, maybe judging every other factor isn't so crucial. Some of you, I can see, struggle with maths like I do. But if you are doing a role that doesn't involve maths and you are being judged on your mathematical skills, again, you're less likely to get a job. Just because you are a specialist in terms of how your brain processes information, it still creates barriers. Should we rate neurodivergent people the same way we do neurotypical? Yes or no? So remember, neurodivergent is a cognitive way of processing information different to the mainstream, mainly things like dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia, those sorts of things. And neurotypical is someone who, of course, has variations in how their brain focuses. But if we're looking at it as a whole, it's more uniformed. Okay, yes, no, no. And currently, we do not make allowances. You know, if you've had a bad family upbringing, poor economic background, from a minority background, neurodiverse, any sort of thing which puts you marginalized in society, you're not getting any different treatment. You are getting the exact same test, which was created by white men. So the results are never going to favor you. If you ever want to wonder why people think, oh, women are worse drivers, or people from minorities backgrounds are less intelligent, or neurodiverse people can't do that, there's no truth in it whatsoever. But it's because we're judging people and marking them through the exact same criteria. So what are the downsides? We've spoken about how IQ tests can be really useful. They can give you a benchmark, a starting point in order to help people. That was the original intention of them. IQ tests were never created to create an us and them society. They were originally created to help people in France. But then, like I said, the Nazis got hold of it and kind of turned it into a you live, you don't live kind of scenario. We spoke about autism history in a previous webinar, but in short, if you had a high IQ and autistic, you were considered like a super soldier in the making. If you had autism and a low IQ, off to the gas chambers. And I'm not even exaggerating. So people made such massive decisions based on something which was created by a small group of human beings. And the test we use today isn't really that different to a test that was created 100 years ago. So some of the downsides include the following: discrimination. If you were to tell me you have a lower IQ, would I treat you differently? Or if I told you right now, my IQ is 80 and we know 100 is the average, would you talk slower to me? Would you patronize me? Would you give me challenging tasks? Probably. And, you know, I think I do have a low IQ, but I wouldn't tell anyone because of that discrimination. But because low IQ is often attached to low ability, and that is also attached to being neurodivergent, again, less opportunities. Just because I tell you I have dyslexia, you're already starting to assume all the things I cannot do in life, rather than the things that I can do really well. So IQ, intelligence, being neurodiverse, different disabilities are all attached to that discrimination. Then you've got the validity. This is, do people actually agree upon it? No. If you ask a lot of scientists, a lot of researchers, a lot of academics, no, there isn't a consensus. There's lots of different tests. There's lots of different ways of measuring it. You know, no one backs it particularly. And then you got the reliability. They're not that accurate. You know, if you were to judge recall you mentioned it, if you were to judge someone today and then you judge them tomorrow, they'll have a completely different score sometimes. If you mark someone hungry or thirsty, or if you mark someone when they've got no income to a lot of income, if they're black, white, Chinese, depending on the background, political climate, it's just not a reliable way of testing people. Maybe you're testing someone who is in dire need of a job, who is really stressed about getting the bills for the end of the month, or you're judging someone who has so many job offers and it doesn't matter. You're going to get unreliable results. So these are all the things which show you why, yes, an IQ test can be a good benchmark, but it should never be the deciding factor or the only factor that is taken into consideration. Another question to all of you: how might IQ tests put a neurodivergent individual at a disadvantage? I mentioned some of them already, but are there any other ways which you think that, say, if you have a different way of processing and seeing the world, that being marked on a series of tests around processing speeds and problem solving could prove problematic? Is there a link with epilepsy and high IQ? That's a good question. I do not know with that. There probably is a link of some sort, but I can't tell you right now. I think I have heard so. There is definitely a link when it comes to autism and high IQ, but again, it depends on a lot of different factors. Okay, we've got to structure rather than measuring creativity. How might IQ test put a neurodiverse individual at a disadvantage? To structure rather than, yeah. So you are basically saying, do this task, how you complete it is how you're going to be marked rather than the particular outcome. I often, when I talk to employers, I tell them about, we often want someone to go to A to B and there's one way of doing it for them. But do you care about the method or do you care about the end result? So maybe more caring about the end result rather than the process, because we all create our own processes in life. I put a little picture of baby Bart Simpson up here, just because he, in one episode of The Simpsons, he was found to have ADHD. And straight away, people marked him really low, and they never gave him the same opportunities as his sister Lisa, who didn't have ADHD. And as you can see throughout the series, he has lots of great skills, but he doesn't believe in himself. He has really low self-esteem. So again, it's really interesting how, from a very young age, it can really set your ongoing viewpoint on how you see yourself. We've got using the same parameters to all. And yeah, we're all different people. Remember, neurodiversity isn't about autism, it's about everyone. We are all different. So it seems just not a really great way, right, to use one method to mark everyone. And this is also how we do diagnostics. We typically look at really black and white areas. So what are some things that can affect our IQ? We've kind of spoken a lot about them already, but there are things which can result in higher or lower. So let's say you have an IQ test and it comes off pretty low. Don't beat yourself up about it, because there are other things that need to be taken into consideration which are not taken into consideration. So these are the factors here, and all I want you to do is move them around and which ones you think have the biggest impact. So let's say you think culture has the biggest impact on your overall intelligence scores. You might want to put that as number 1. If you think nutrition, barely an impact at all, you might want to put it as a 5. Like, I really do like this little gif of Homer. Is this ingenious? Like, he's found a shortcut to exercising, or is it not smart at all because he's not seeing the bigger picture? And on here, we've got educational access. Do you think having access to quality education has the biggest impact on overall IQ? Or having a healthy, balanced diet, getting your 5 a day? Maybe it's the culture you grow up in, the environment, the medical conditions. Now, just to state this, when it comes to race, there is no difference, okay? But it is interesting why we have perceived difference. So how do I educational access? Got number 1. I'm going to prove to you why it doesn't really make much sense. So years ago, they did some tests, right? And they measured the IQ of some really smart children. And then they wanted to repeat the same test every year with different groups of children who achieved really high scores. Now, they didn't, because the test is always updating, so it's really difficult to compare previous generations with current generations, but they use the exact same test. And they noticed that children were getting ridiculously smart, right? Like, it's way, way smarter each year than you would even think possible, even with any sort of natural evolution. What they found out is that the kids had better education, better food, better environments, so their IQs improved. So it was not fair to just say people are smarter today than they were back in the day. It wasn't true. Environment. If you live in a place which doesn't have heating or is cold or no food, of course it's going to have an impact. Different medical conditions. You know, again, dyslexia is a big one. It means you take a little bit longer to process. So naturally your scores are going to be lower, but your emotional intelligence could be through the roof. And culture, when we look at culture, you know, there's a stereotype that a lot of people from Asia are really, really smart or really great at maths. Not true. I know a lot of ones are terrible at maths, but the reason why that kind of stereotype came across is because of the culture where work is really important, because they typically came from a place of development where there was poverty and they know that education is essential, where in, say, in Western countries, we've kind of taken it a bit for granted. So culture plays a really big part in that and how we view education overall. Now, we're almost done, but the history of IQ tests, as I said, wasn't that negative. It started off good, then it went absolutely terrible during the war, and now it's kind of like plateaued a bit, but still a bit outdated. So this is one of the first images of a child having a test done. and they were originally created for children. So to start off right at the start of the journey, Alfred Binet was the OG guy who created the test. Again, he was in France and he noticed that kids were struggling. So he created a test, all great intentions, but it was really basic. This worked for children and not adults because children have more standardized ways of developing through early years. A 1-year-old to a 4-year-old, completely different game, but a 40-year-old to a 43-year-old, hardly any difference. Then Charles Spearman came along and he developed the concept of general intelligence. And general intelligence is what we expect people to know at certain ages. They call it the G factor, kind of like the X factor, not really. Now, the G factor was the base. Everyone wanted to get the best G factor. And it was, again, the sweet point. Not intelligent enough, no opportunities, no ability to do things. Too intelligent, depressed. Just the right amount, that's a sweet spot for real productivity. And then moving on, during World War I, IQ tests started to be used outside of context of education, and they were even used in the army. So what they would do is if you had a good IQ test, you could be a leader, you could be a general, a manager, off you go. Low IQ test, off to the mines. So they really used it as like, you get a bad job, you get a good job. And then that was how the Americans used it. But in Nazi Germany, they used it for far, far more sinister things. If you had a high IQ, brilliant, you can breed and reproduce. If you had a low IQ, it was terrible, really bad. And this was never the original intention, but that's kind of like how it developed. Oh, Raquel said, did they compare children from rural areas and those in the cities when the tests were done? Unfortunately, they did. And as we mentioned, if you're in a rural place, you don't have the same education, you don't have the same nutrition, you might not have parents available to support you. It just wasn't fair. The amount of people with disabilities during World War II that got euthanized, killed, or abused, or just kind of neglected due to failing IQ test was, sickeningly large. And this is why even today that things like autism have such a negative connotations, and it does stem back to the link. People linked different ways of thinking to having a low intelligence, and low intelligence is linked to being an underachiever and being a drain on resources. We know that's not true, but that is how it has been viewed for over 100 years. And now moving on to modern days, David Wexler, probably pronounced that wrong, developed the IQ test that we still use today. So 1950s till today, we're pretty much using the same form of managing intelligence. And think how different the world is from then to now, yet we haven't really updated the process whatsoever. Now we're on the last one now is, great, where to find an IQ test? If I haven't put you off today and you're still keen to find out, again, there is some use in it. It's not all doom and gloom. Where can you go? Well, first of all, you can go down the official route by going to a psychologist. They will give you a proper licensed one. If you don't want to go to a licensed psychiatrist, go to BuzzFeed and find out what type of donut you are. There's lots of really bad ones online, okay? They're not all equal. So it's far better if you want a real an accurate understanding of your intelligence to go to a psychologist. Then you've got like Mensa, which is like the standard form of measuring intelligence. They have a free online test, but take it with a pinch of salt with all the other factors that we mentioned today. I'd say they're probably the most accurate independent study. But then you've got ones that can measure emotional intelligence, such as the 16 personality tests. You also can go on our website and find out the likelihood you might have dyspraxia or OCD or depression. Now, they're not really that official whatsoever, but they're more of a starting point. And I think if you take any of these tests as a starting point, there can be use in them. But if you take them as like God's law, you're going to probably get quite depressed and disheartened by them, because we always hear about these people with really high IQs. But as we know, the majority of the population will have a fluctuation between 115 to 80. Or don't even bother, because What good is it? Does it really help you? Knowing my IQ has not helped me at all. In many years, it spent me years and years trying to prove to myself that it doesn't matter. So I don't always think it's that useful, but it's a personal decision, but do not think it's really that useful. My final thoughts is this. So there's a quote which is supposedly by Einstein. I'm not sure if that's even true, but apparently he said, if you judge a fish by how it climbs a tree, it will always feel that it is stupid. It's essentially saying it is not a fair method. We are all different. Obviously, the monkey's going to climb the tree, but the elephant might be a lot better at other areas. So while IQ tests can reveal information about an individual's ability in certain domains, it is important to remember that other factors, including such things as adaptive skills, emotional intelligence, and task performance, are also important indicators of an individual's capability. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, capability. Are you able to do the job or the role or the activity that you want to do? The other things don't really kind of give you that information. So what we covered today, if successful, was problem solving. How can you even calculate your intelligence? Defining key concepts, looking how IQ tests show the ability to learn, or maybe the lack of ability. And also who invented it, because historical context is important when looking at these things. Now, if any of you are like, you know what, Nat, I would love to learn more about my brain, you can always get in contact with exceptional individuals. And we also offer free assessments in the workplace. And the good thing about these assessments, which are not official diagnostic assessments, is that it doesn't matter. We take you as a whole individual, looking at your current scenario, your work patterns, how your brain works. You're seen as a full-fledged human being rather than just examining one aspect of you. And this is typically free for those who live in the UK, or if in the US, there's a small charge attached. But it's a really good thing to do if you are in the workplace. Feel free to check our website if you want a bit more information on that. Now, any questions before we wrap up for the day? Any last questions on intelligence, how we measure it, IQs, or any opinions or statements? Okay, well, if there are no questions, what I will say is you can always message me later on because ideas might pop into your head. And as I said at the very start of today, we do webinars every single week. Next week, we're going off grid and we're doing a really fun one, just because it's nice to mix them up a little bit. Neurodiversity in anime. I don't know if any of you have noticed this. There's definitely a link between those who have autism and loving anime. I don't get it. Anime trains, it's a thing. I don't want to be pushing stereotypes here, but it's a thing. So we are going to be looking at how neurodiversity fits in with anime, why we like it so much, how it links in, how it's represented. And in many ways, this is going to be a bit of a case study on Japan as well, because we often look at neurodiversity from a UK perspective, but how do other countries show it? We also have our YouTube channel where you can like and subscribe, hit that little bell icon and all that good stuff where you can catch up on our other webinars. If you like today's one, I recommend checking out the Hans Asperger's one, looking about eugenics, World War II, and how autistic people were treated. And if you want to stay engaged, we have a Facebook group where you can rant and troll people. Don't do that. But, it's a really safe group where we share opportunities, people get to know each other, and it's a good supportive network. We also have a LinkedIn page, which is up and coming, meaning we need to add more content to it. But if you're looking for jobs and opportunities, it's not a bad place to start. And as I mentioned, we do have tests available online. They're not IQ tests, but they are characteristic tests on different neurodivergent characteristics or qualities. They are a starting point to a longer discussion. If you get 100% ADHD, doesn't mean you've got ADHD, but it does mean that it might be worth having a follow-up conversation with your GP, for example. And here's our contact details. So if you want to get in contact, go to our website, drop us an email at admin@accept.co.uk. My name's been Nat. You can always drop me an email at nat@accept.co.uk. And here's our phone number if you want to call us. I really hope you all found that useful today and got a couple little gems out of it. And hopefully see you next week if you're available. All right, all. Well, hopefully I'll see you next week and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Great, Nat. Well done.
Thank you very much.